The Supreme Court, in a pair of cases Thursday, severely limited the use of race as a factor in college admissions, upending decades of affirmative action programs that U.S. institutions have used to select students from their applicant pools. In rulings that broke across ideological lines, the court's six conservative justices invalidated Harvard and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's admissions practices by ruling they did not comply with the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection. Both programs lack sufficiently focused and measurable objectives warranting the use of race, unavoidably employ race in a negative manner, involve racial stereotyping, and lack meaningful endpoints, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote for the majority. We have never permitted admission programs to work in that way, and we will not do so today, he continued. At the same time, as all parties agree, nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. In a rare occurrence, conservative Justice Clarence Thomas read his concurring opinion from the bench, advocating for a colorblind view of the Constitution. Liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor also read her dissent. The court today makes clear that in the future, universities wishing to discriminate based on race and admissions must articulate and justify a compelling and measurable state interest based on concrete evidence. Given the strictures set out by the court, I highly doubt any will be able to do so, Thomas wrote. The court's decision adds to a legal crusade by conservative legal strategist Edward Blum, who formed Students for Fair Admissions and separately challenged the administration policies of Harvard and UNC nearly a decade ago. The Biden administration has backed the two schools before the justice, but after affirmative action at college survived multiple previous challenges at the Supreme Court, the bench's increasingly conservative makeup has now handed down a major blow. In other words, a student must be treated based on his or her experience as an individual, not on the basis of race, Roberts wrote. Many universities have for too long done just the opposite, and in doing so, they have concluded wrongly that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Our constitutional history does not tolerate that choice. After Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson joined the bench last year, the justices considered SFFA's challenges separately. Jackson served in the Harvard's Board of Overseers until last spring and agreed to recuse her from that school's case during a confirmation hearing. The court handed down a 6-3 ruling against UNC and a 6-2 ruling against Harvard, given Jackson's recusal in the latter. The Supreme Court first laid the groundwork for affirmative action in 1978 as it decided a challenge to the University of California system that reserved 16 out of 100 seats for members of certain minority groups. The justice in the splintered decision struck down the quota system, but no opinion garnered a majority of votes. Lower courts were left grappling with whether to consider as binding precedent the opinion of Justice Lewis Powell, whose swing vote invalidated the quota while more broadly upholding race consensus admissions. Schools across the country modeled their affirmative action programs on Powell's opinion in the years following. Today, this court stands in the way and rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress, Sotomayor wrote in dissent. It holds that race can no longer be used in a limited way in college admissions to achieve such critical benefits. In so holding, the court cements a superficial rule of colorblindness as a constitutional principle in an endemically segregated society where race has always mattered and continues to matter. A quarter century later, a majority of justices in Grutter versus Bowling upheld affirmative action endorsing Powell's argument. They ruled Title VI and the Equal Protection Clause allowed the narrowly tailored use of race in admissions decisions to further a compelling interest in obtaining the educational benefits that flow from a diverse student body. The Supreme Court left affirmative action intact in two subsequent challenges. So we're getting a history lesson here. I'm starting to find it really interesting how a lot of these Supreme Court cases that people are saying are awful and terrible and very restrictive in whichever way they decide to call them are. It's like when I read these statements, they have a lot of really fancy grammar. These are people who went to Ivy League schools. But it's like as I read it, I'm almost. It's like the grammar is top tier, but the argumentation is at the bottom. Where Roberts says, or rather wrote, we're against the use of race, unavoidably employ race in a negative manner, involve racial stereotyping, and lack meaningful endpoints. The purpose of affirmative action, as I understand it, especially when you're talking about a lot of these Ivy League schools, is that it basically said, hey, look, in general, whites and Asians tend to have very, very large, excuse me, majority of the A students are the students who are in the top percentile academically are Caucasian or Asian. And there are a few black students, Hispanic students, who also perform to that same degree or close to that same degree, but who would otherwise be overlooked by virtue of race not being a factor in admissions. And I've said before, the thing about Ivy League schools and their little 5 and 6 and 2% acceptance rates is that you can be an A+ student with all types of extracurriculars as well and still possibly not get into that school. And it has nothing to do with how good your grades were or how academically inclined you were. Sometimes they just aren't admitting enough people for you to qualify. So affirmative action really did make it to where students who otherwise would have been overlooked or not given an actual chance of going there were treated with some priority, at the very least of meeting a quota. And my thing is, they try to say, oh, race is this big thing, but really race it's a factor, but it's not that big of a deal. Because I, for example, was not an A student. I ranged from C's to B's. Harvard is not going to pick me over someone who happens to be Caucasian or Asian that has A's from top to bottom on their report cards and transcripts simply because of my ethnicity. They would never say, oh, well, we can pick the person who's got all A's, but instead we're going to pick this other person with B's and C's or even lower than that because of their race. It doesn't work that way. So the idea that your race is going to somehow make it to where a thing you did, and that's really what the problem I have with this argumentation is. They try to act as if race somehow makes every door that wouldn't have opened for you just open. Like, oh, this person is black, so they get into an Ivy League school. It's like, no, they worked hard, they got the grades, and because their ethnic group or their particular minority group tends to not get into these types of schools, these schools feel like, hey, we should acknowledge and reward the few that are able to make it here. And I don't see anything wrong with that. But again, it's all based on that same thing of just trying to pretend that things are fair and I've always been equal, and there's no there's never been a any kind of bias on the basis of race in America. That's totally not a thing that's ever happened. And I agree with Sotomayor's dissent. She said, it holds that race can no longer be used in a limited way in college admissions to achieve such critical benefits. In so holding, the court cements a superficial rule of colorblindness as a constitutional principle in an endemically segregated society where race has always mattered and continues to matter. It is superficial to say, oh, well, we got rid of this thing that takes race into consideration when determining what students will go there. So now we are getting closer to our colorblind society. The same one where we had to have affirmative action because minority students weren't getting in anywhere near the amount of their Caucasian counterparts. So all I can say is I'm glad that I left college in the dustbin years ago, and that this is one more thing they've done that won't affect me. But I do feel bad for students that are coming up that are trying to get into these schools, because they just took one more tool out of your toolbox. And it's really unfortunate because a lot of students, especially I guess I'll say minority ones as well, there is a desire by those who reach that top 1 percentile, that A+, that A, just that group works very hard. And I hate the inference from the court's decision, or rather from their ruling, that just because this person is a minority. They're just being handed entry into some Ivy League school, and that's not the case. They're working just as hard as anyone else. But again, that program has allowed them to have a place and a larger chance of actually being able to gain admission to these schools. So another L for the Supreme Court, but then again, I'm not too surprised.